I call the Right Honourable David Carter.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the member who has just resumed to seat, Dr Duncan Webb, for a spirited contribution. But my question, having listened to him, is the current law already adequate for the very behaviour he talked about? And I want to, well, somebody interjected no, but I want to give an example whereby I suspect the caucus hasn't been fully informed by the Labor Cabinet. And when the previous government introduced the National Animal Identification and Tracing legislation, it required the stock and station industry to be deeply involved in the implementation. And I think almost inadvertently some of those companies got together as they sorted out appropriate charges that they'd make at particular sale yards for the completion of the NAIT obligations. As I say, almost inadvertently, I think those companies fell foul of commerce legislation at the time because they were accused by the Commerce Commission of price fixing, exactly the sort of behaviour that Dr Duncan Webb said we should not tolerate in New Zealand. And I happen to know that some of those companies recognised that they'd broken the current law and were fined many hundreds of thousands of dollars. One major stock and station company decided to fight the Commerce Commission and lost, and I think I'd be right in saying their total cost would have exceeded $1 million. So in the spirited contribution you've just heard, I ask the question whether the very situation which Dr Webb has raised is not already covered by commerce legislation in this country. Which leads me to the relevant question that should be asked, is this legislation necessary tonight? And I listened to Paul Goldsmith's, the Honourable Paul Goldsmith's contribution, and I think he's got it in one. The Cabinet has sat there and panicked about the amount of legislation that they have to present on an order paper. I think we're getting very, very close to the situation where we're going to have to, the government's going to have to consider changing the sitting program that's been set by the Parliament at the start of the parliamentary term, simply because they haven't got a legislative agenda. That's what's going on here. I can imagine the panic call around the Cabinet saying, get your officials to find anything that we can bring before the House, claim it's urgent, claim it's important, and here we are within 5 months of the election discussing the Commerce Criminalisation of Cartels Amendment Bill. I say to the government, is this all you've got to talk about, having won an election and with an agenda? I cannot believe we're in the House tonight finding this important enough to do. And what's clear to me after the contribution from Duncan Webb is that he truly doesn't understand the current legislation. He doesn't understand the necessity for this legislation. He can't ask for it. And if you wanted a further example for the fact that the government doesn't know what it's doing, listen to the very lacklustre performance from the Honourable Chris Farfoy when he introduced this legislation. This legislation will impose costs on the business community. And we've got a regulatory impact statement prepared by the government, well, not prepared by the government for this particular legislation because it hasn't had time to do it, but I go back and look at a previous regulatory impact statement, and that then says that they're not sure about the cost that will be imposed on business by this legislation. I say to this government, it's been around now for 5 months. You should have had an agenda when you won the election. It's time to come forward and debate your agenda, and the best that the government can do is come up with a Commerce Criminalisation of Cartels Amendment Bill. If that's the best they can do after 9 long years in opposition, it's time they really considered whether they're worthy of being the government of this country.